Blind Date by Chris Harvey. Okay, so she had been stood up. It wasn't the first time and it probably wouldn't be the last. But it was disappointing. Dean had seemed so sincere and she really liked him, and he was gorgeous, one of the best looking guys she had ever seen. But he wasn't coming. Over the half hour she'd been waiting, Ruth's ego had slowly but surely deflated. Meeting Dean had been on her mind all day. She had watched the clock, desperate for the night to come. She had done her makeup with a permanent smile on her face and with the sensation of floating on cloud nine. And all for nothing. Ruth tried to smile and push away the anger which had suddenly welled up inside her. She mentally scolded herself. She really ought to know men by now. She heaved a sigh and glanced at her watch. 9:30. As she hooked her handbag onto her shoulder and lifted herself from the park bench, she noticed how quickly darkness had fallen during the 30 minutes she had been here. Now she could only just make out the winding pathway and the outlines of the many trees and bushes which landscaped the vicinity. It was a strange place to be asked to meet someone at night, but then it had been Dean's idea, and she'd been so high with his proposition that she hadn't really thought about it. What a mug! Ruth emerged from her boiling thoughts as she became aware of the clacking of heels in front of her, alternating with the sound of her own. She looked up and squinted through the darkness and saw the unmistakable outline of a young woman walking along the pathway towards her, alone. It was the first person she had seen since entering the park, and with mild curiosity she glanced casually at the girl's face as she approached. Although the light was dim, Ruth could make out quite clearly a pretty face which smiled back at her as she passed, and she was struck by a vague recognition. The girl's face was somehow familiar, but try as she might, Ruth just couldn't place it. The girl passed and Ruth waited a moment before glancing over her shoulder. Thankfully, the girl wasn't doing the same, so Ruth continued to appraise the departing figure. That walk, the way the girl held herself, swung her arm, it was all somehow familiar, but why? Who? Still deep in thought, she continued along the path that led out of the park, and it suddenly occurred to her that if she hurried she might just catch the girls before they went out. If she did, she could still go out with them. But why waste a good night? Trying to push Dean and the girl out of her mind, she quickened her pace and heard a scream from behind. The high-pitched shrill had the effect of someone screaming, "Stop!" and Ruth froze in her tracks, an ice-cold feather sprinting up her spine. And then the sound pierced her senses again, even more desperate and drawn out, and she realized what it was. The grip on her body relaxed and she span around, squinting through the ever-deepening darkness, taking a step forward at the same time. And to her horror she could see the cause. It was the girl. But she wasn't alone. She was struggling with someone, obviously a man who was trying his best to overpower her. In big red letters the word rape flashed before Ruth's eyes, and she was running now, cursing the fact that she was wearing high heels. "Hey, leave her alone!" she screamed. The man suddenly looked up in her direction. He froze for a moment and then he threw the girl down hard onto the grass. Ruth was almost on top of him when he turned and fled, disappearing through a gap in the bushes. She skidded to a halt, realizing that it was unwise to pursue him any further, and more concerned anyway for the girl's welfare. But she screamed after him, "Go on, get out of here, you animal, I'm calling the police!" The girl was lying face down, whimpering on the dewy grass. Herself shocked by the events of the last minute, Ruth knelt down beside her. She tried to calm and reassure the girl as she helped her slowly to her feet and looked into her face. Tears clouded the girl's eyes and had run down her cheeks, cutting muddy pathways of salty tears and mascara through the heavy makeup. "Are you okay?" Ruth asked. Obviously trying her best to control the spasmodic twitching racking her body, The girl nodded. And again Ruth was struck by that same recognition, only this time it seemed even stronger. Curling her arm around the girl's shoulders, she helped her to the bench where she herself had been sitting only minutes earlier, waiting for Dean to arrive. The girl soon managed to find her voice again. The tears stopped. Ruth discovered that her name was Sylvia, but thereafter the girl's words fell on deaf ears, as Ruth's attention focused yet again on her familiarity. She looked deep into the intense blue eyes, watched the full lips forming the words. Where had she seen this girl before? It was something the girl said that finally dragged Ruth back to the real world, and with a jolt. I was coming to meet someone. A new boyfriend. I only met him for the first time last night. Doesn't look like he's turning up though, does it? Ruth couldn't believe it. What a remarkable coincidence. Oh, so that wasn't him who just attacked you? She asked. Oh no, he looked nothing like him. So where did you meet this new boyfriend? In Scott's last night. Ruth froze. This was unbelievable. The same nightclub where she had met Dean. She swallowed the rising lump in her throat. She had to ask one more question. What was his name? Dean. I don't know his second name. Ruth's head began to spin. What was this? It was like some weird nightmare. Are you all right? Ruth snapped back to see Sylvia looking at her, a little puzzled. She tried to smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Listen, Sylvia said. I want to thank you for coming to my rescue. Don't be silly, I only did what anyone would do. Sylvia shook her head. Not in this day and age, they wouldn't. Good Samaritans are few and far between nowadays. Plenty would have just carried on as if nothing had happened. Well, not me, Ruth assured her. After a pause, Sylvia said, Look, will you come back for a drink? It's the least I can do, and it'll give us a chance to have a proper chat. Ruth faltered for a moment. Then she realized that there was absolutely no reason whatsoever not to go. She smiled broadly. Why not? Great. Sylvia quickly stood up, now looking none too worse for her ordeal, apart from a few smudges of mud and ruined makeup. So where do we get the bus? Ruth asked, rising to her feet. We don't. My car's parked just around the corner. Along with the small talk as they headed out of the park, Ruth once again found herself being niggled by the familiarity of Sylvia. So much so that, by the time they were in the car and heading away, she was unable to keep it to herself any longer. I know this is going to sound really corny, but I'm sure we've met somewhere before. Sylvia flicked her eyes from the road and glanced across at Ruth, the corners of her mouth creasing into a smile. We have. Eh? Well, I've seen you in Scott's. You go in every week, don't you? Well, so do I. But I've never spoken to you before, have I? And I could have sworn I have. Sylvia chuckled and shrugged, and Ruth was glad to see that she had fully recovered from her ordeal. The car headed out of town, then down a long and straight country lane. Eventually Sylvia turned the car right and steered along a now winding and even narrower lane. Live out in the wilds, do you? Ruth asked, nodding towards the windscreen. Sylvia smiled and shot her a quick glance. No, this is just the quickest way to get there. Won't be long now. She didn't say anything else, and Ruth was a little surprised that she didn't seem as talkative as she had been. For some reason, as the silence enveloped her again, Ruth found herself thinking about the guy she had set out to meet that night. Was his name really Dean? Was he the same guy who had asked Sylvia out as well? It certainly looked that way. And who else had he made a date with and stood up? Probably the entire female clientele in Scott's by the sound of things. Ruth pushed herself back into the passenger seat, toying with the idea of telling Sylvia that someone called Dean, who she too had met in Scots, had asked her out. It all seemed a remarkable coincidence. As she pondered over the night's events, she looked across at Sylvia again. The girl really did seem to have recovered well from her attack. As if aware that she was being stared at, Sylvia glanced across at her. "I'm sorry if I seem a bit of a bore, but I hate rabbiting on when I'm driving. I've got a confession to make." The words just came out before Ruth had time to change her mind, and Sylvia's face creased with puzzlement. "Oh? And what mortal sin is this?" She gave a chuckle. "I was meeting a guy tonight too." Sylvia kept her gaze fixed on the road. She began to slow the car as they neared a gateway at the side of the road. "And I met him in Scots as well." The car disappeared into the opening of the woods and began to slow down. Sylvia looked across at her passenger, her eyes widening. "Oh? And you're not going to believe it, but his name was Dean too." Sylvia switched off the engine. "Well, fancy that," she said, a strange tone to her voice. Ruth registered all three things at the same time. The fact that the car had stopped. The fact that Sylvia's voice had suddenly changed. The fact that something cold and sharp was pressing into the back of her neck. Light flooded the interior of the car as Sylvia reached up and flicked on the light. Dazzled for a moment, Ruth tried to focus her eyes. Sylvia was still smiling, but it was nothing like her previously warm and friendly expression. The blade of the knife was pushed even more dangerously into Ruth's neck from behind, and from the corner of her eye, Ruth could make out the shape of something rising behind her. Another person. She froze, too terrified even to breathe. The sharp steel was close to puncturing her skin. Her eyes bulged wide, her heart pounded inside her ears. She gazed questioningly at Sylvia, whose cold smile was now widening. "Thanks for everything, Ruth. We really do appreciate it, but now we want to have some fun." Sylvia's voice had suddenly deepened, her ruby-red lips curling back into a mocking leer, revealing the white and perfect teeth. And oh so familiar smile. Behind her, the person with the knife leant forwards, falling into Ruth's vision. It took her only a moment to recognize him as the man who had attacked Sylvia in the park, but in the same instant she suddenly realized why Sylvia had seemed so familiar. And as the driver reached up and pulled the wig off his head, Ruth's terrible suspicions were confirmed. It was Dean. As everything started to spin before her, her two captors began to laugh, deep masculine bellows of excited laughter. And then, unclipping his seatbelt, Dean reached out towards her. Ruth almost chuckled, but instead, as Dean's fingers, nails painted blood red, closed around her throat, she screamed. She really ought to know men by now.